The morning air in Dublin carried a chill that bit through thin wool and worn coats. It was the early 1840s, and the city stirred awake with the groan of cartwheels and the faint clatter of boots on cobblestones. But beneath that ordinary rhythm of life, there was something else moving, a slow hunger creeping into the streets, a quiet desperation that few could name yet, but many had begun to feel. The markets were thinner now, the loaves smaller, the faces longer. Even the gulls circling above the river Liffey seemed to swoop lower these days, as if searching for scraps that no one had left behind. Patrick Byrne, no older than 12, pressed his hands into the pockets of his patched trousers and walked quickly past the river's edge. His sister, Maeve, followed a few steps behind, clutching a ragged shawl around her shoulders. Their father had gone out before dawn, promising to bring back something, anything, that could be boiled into a meal. The word potatoes had once been a comfort in their home, a promise of full bellies and a warm fire. But lately it had become a ghost of a word, whispered without hope. "Do you think he'll find any today?" Maeve asked, her voice small and uncertain, her eyes scanning the half-empty stalls. Patrick didn't answer right away. He was old enough to know that hope sometimes hurt more than hunger. "If he does, we'll hear him before we see him," he said finally, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "He always sings when he's got something good." Around them, Dublin was beginning to show its bones. Grand buildings stood beside crumbling tenements. The wealth of the city, what little of it remained, lived in polished windows and behind iron gates, while just streets away, barefoot children ran errands for pennies, and mothers lined up for a ladle of thin soup. Horses pulled carriages over bridges where ragged boys lingered, hoping to carry a bag or open a door for a coin. And in the alleyways, the smell of rot and damp clung like a curse. The famine had not yet reached its worst. At least that's what people said, but already the signs were there. Potatoes turned soft and black in the fields. Men left for England in search of work, sometimes never to return. Soup kitchens whispered of charity, but offered little. And rumors traveled faster than the mail. Rumors of ships leaving full and coming back empty, of grain being shipped away while the poor starved at home. Patrick and Maeve turned into a narrow lane where the cobblestones were slick with last night's rain. A woman sat against the wall with a baby wrapped in her shawl, her eyes half closed from exhaustion. The baby stirred, let out a weak cry, and then went quiet again. Patrick looked away. He had learned that in Dublin, if you stopped for every hungry face, you would never get anywhere. "Do you think it will get worse?" Maeve asked suddenly, her fingers tightening on the shawl. Patrick hesitated. The question lingered between them like a breath of cold air. "I think," he said slowly, "we'll have to be clever. Clever people get through hard times." But even as he said it, a cart rolled past carrying sacks of flour, guarded by two men in heavy coats, and he wondered what cleverness could do when your pockets were empty and your stomach growled. By the time they reached their street, the day had brightened, though the sun offered no warmth. Their mother stood at the doorway, a thin figure with sharp cheekbones and eyes that searched the road behind them. When she saw only her children, her shoulders fell slightly, though she said nothing. Words were precious now, like bread. Inside, the house smelled faintly of peat smoke and damp walls. There was no breakfast laid out, only an empty pot on the hearth. Patrick sat by the small fire and rubbed his hands together, pretending it gave off more heat than it did. Maeve sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Did you hear?" their mother said at last, her voice low. "They say a ship came in last night. Grain from America." Patrick's head snapped up. "For us." She shook her head. "Not for us. For the merchants. They'll sell it to London first." Patrick felt his stomach twist, not just from hunger, but from something sharper, a slow, creeping anger that had no name yet. Outside, the city was moving, always moving, but he wondered who it moved for. Later that day, Patrick wandered down to the quays where the ship lay anchored. Its tall masts reached into the gray sky, and men bustled about, hauling crates and barrels. He stood there a long while, watching the food leave the city, feeling the damp wind off the water bite at his skin. He thought of the woman with the baby, of his mother's tired eyes, of Maeve's thin hands clutching at his coat. And then he saw something that made his breath catch. A group of men in worn coats, their faces gaunt but their eyes burning with something fierce, lingered by the warehouse doors. They weren't workers, and they weren't guards. They were watching, waiting. One of them, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, turned and met Patrick's eyes for a moment. It was only a glance, but in that glance was a promise of trouble, of hunger turned into action, of something coming that would not wait for permission. Patrick stepped back, his heart thudding in his chest. He didn't know who those men were or what they wanted, but he felt the city holding its breath around them. The famine had begun, though the worst was yet to come. And in the damp streets of Dublin, where hunger gnawed louder than the church bells and the nights grew longer, a choice was forming in the hearts of many, between waiting and surviving, between silence and something else entirely. Patrick turned for home, unaware that by the end of the week, his life, and the life of every soul in those narrow streets, would change in ways he could not yet imagine. The following morning arrived with a pale light that struggled to break through the heavy Dublin clouds. The streets were damp again, slick with a mist that never seemed to lift this time of year. Patrick rose before Maeve, pulling on his threadbare coat as quietly as he could so as not to wake her. Their father had not returned in the night. That was becoming common now, nights where he would go looking for work or food and not come back until dawn, sometimes empty-handed, sometimes with nothing at all to say. Patrick did not ask anymore. Questions cost energy, and they had learned to save every bit of that for staying warm and moving forward. Outside, the city already hummed with the sounds of early trade. Horse hooves clattered on stones, and the air carried the sharp tang of coal smoke mixed with the faint aroma of baking bread that most would never taste. Patrick followed the smell, not because he hoped to buy anything, but because it led him toward the docks again. Something about that ship from the day before gnawed at him. He had seen hunger before, yes, but not eyes like those men had, sharp, restless, like wolves waiting at the edge of a campfire. He turned a corner and found himself in the shadow of one of Dublin's grand churches, its bell tower looming high over streets that hardly heard prayers answered anymore. A group of children, no older than he was, crouched near the steps, scratching lines in the dirt with sticks. One of them looked up. "You heard about the grain, didn't you?" the boy said, his voice hoarse. Patrick paused. "What about it?" "They're saying some of it's going missing," the boy whispered, glancing around as if the stones themselves might listen. "Crates emptied before they ever leave the dock. Guards can't say where." Patrick frowned. "Who dare?" he asked. The boy shrugged. "Hungry folk, maybe, or ones who've had enough of being hungry." It was a dangerous thing to say out loud, even if it carried a flicker of truth. Patrick felt that same twist in his stomach again, that same thought he had pushed down the day before. If there was food, and it was being sent away, and yet people here were starving, how long before the city stopped waiting? He kept walking, the cold seeping into his shoes, the drizzle turning his hair damp. Dublin was a city of contrasts, stone mansions and broken alleys, carriages and bare feet. Along one street, merchants shouted over the price of candles and cloth. On the next, a mother sold her last bits of firewood for a few copper pennies. The famine was not just in the fields. It was crawling its way into the heart of the city, one empty pot at a time. When Patrick reached the quay, the ship was still there, its rigging clattering softly in the breeze. The same men guarded the crates, though they looked wearier now, as if the weight of their task pressed harder with each passing hour. And again, Patrick saw them, the watchers. They were closer this time, their group a little larger. One leaned against a post, a rough scarf wrapped around his neck, his eyes following every sack of grain that moved. Another crouched near a stack of barrels, pretending to tie his boot. Patrick lingered by a lamppost, trying not to draw attention, but the scarred man from the day before saw him again. This time, the man did not just glance. He nodded, a slow, deliberate motion, as if to say, "You see what we see, don't you?" Patrick's heart beat faster. He turned away, but the image stuck with him even as he wound through the narrow lanes toward home. Hunger had made thieves of many before, but this felt different. This felt organized. This felt like the start of something. At home, May was awake now, sitting by the window and watching the street below. "Ma'am says we might go to the church hall tonight," she said without turning. "They're giving out bread." Patrick sat beside her. "If they have enough for everyone," he murmured. His mother, busy at the hearth with a kettle of weak tea, gave him a look. "Don't speak like that," she said quietly. "We'll go, and we'll be grateful for what comes." He nodded, but inside he wondered how long gratitude could fill his stomach. The day wore on slowly, as days did when there was little to do and less to eat. Patrick helped fetch water, mended a loose shutter, and listened to the street. There were whispers everywhere now. Men at corners speaking in low tones, women at the pump shaking their heads over rising prices, children running errands for coins that bought half of what they had the week before. That night, they walked to the church hall with dozens of others, the street lanterns flickering in the wind. The line stretched down the block, faces pale in the lamplight, some hopeful, some already resigned. When they reached the doorway, a priest in a heavy coat handed them each a small piece of bread, barely enough for one mouth, let alone three. Still, their mother thanked him, tucking the bread into her shawl as if it were gold. As they turned to leave, Patrick caught sight of the scarred man again. This time at the far end of the street, his arms folded as he watched the line. For a moment, Patrick thought the man might come forward, might say something, but he only turned and disappeared into the fog. That night, sleep did not come easily. The city felt restless, as if something was stirring in its bones. Patrick lay awake listening to the wind rattle the window pane, to the distant rumble of a cart on the cobbles, to Maeve's quiet breathing beside him. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but it was not just hunger anymore. It was the sense that something was about to break, and when it did, none of them would be able to hide from it. By dawn, the city had a new whisper. The grain stores had been raided. Guards found crates missing, doors forced in the night. No one claimed to know who did it, but already the merchants were demanding more soldiers, more watchmen, more control. And among the poor, among the hungry and the hollow-eyed, there was a different kind of murmur, one that sounded almost like hope or perhaps defiance. Patrick heard it as he fetched water that morning. He heard it as he passed the quay, now crowded with soldiers. And he felt it as he saw the scarred man once more, standing at the edge of the market with that same unspoken message in his eyes. Something was moving through the famine streets of Dublin, something that carried risk and promise in equal measure. And Patrick, though he did not know it yet, was already caught in its path. The third morning came with a thin frost on the rooftops, a soft layer of white that looked almost beautiful if you didn't know what it meant. Cold meant more fuel for fires, more coins spent that no one had to spare. Patrick woke before the first light, his stomach already turning with the ache of another day without a real meal. Maeve stirred but did not rise. Their mother was already at the door, fastening her worn shawl. "I'm going to see if Mrs. Keegan has any scraps left from her bake," she said quietly, not wanting to wake the neighbors. "Stay in. Mind your sister." Patrick wanted to ask when their father would return, but the words stuck in his throat. They hadn't heard from him in 2 nights now, and the silence around his absence had grown too heavy to break. He sat by the fire that barely held a glow and listened to the distant sounds of Dublin coming alive, carts creaking over cobblestones, gulls crying over the river, the low murmur of voices moving with purpose and worry. Outside, the city seemed to grow thinner by the day. Bread cost more this week than it had the last, and rumors of sickness in the poorer lanes spread like the smoke that drifted over the rooftops. When Maeve finally rose, she clutched the blanket tight around her shoulders. "I dreamt we had stew," she whispered, her voice a little hoarse, "with carrots and meat, and a loaf of bread as big as the table." Patrick forced a smile. "One day," he said, "one day we'll have 2 loaves." She smiled faintly, but neither of them believed it much. By mid-morning, Patrick could no longer stay still. The frost had melted into a damp chill, and the streets smelled of coal and wet stone. He stepped out, his hands buried deep in his pockets, his eyes scanning the faces around him. The city was changing, and not just because of the famine. There was a tension now, a tightness in the air, like a rope pulled too far. At the edge of the market, a crowd had gathered. A man stood on a crate, his clothes rough, but his voice steady. "They ship the grain to England," he said, "while your children starve. They fill their coffers while our streets rot. How long will we wait?" A guard barked for the crowd to move along, but Patrick noticed the way people lingered, the way they listened. Hunger made the words sharper. Hunger made people brave in ways they were not before. He spotted the scarred man again, standing at the fringe, his arms folded, his eyes not on the speaker, but on the crowd itself, as if measuring it, weighing who might follow when the time came. Patrick moved on, his heart quickening. He wanted no part trouble. Trouble meant soldiers, and soldiers meant punishment. But the thought stuck with him. How long could the city go on like this? How long could families stretch a crust of bread to feed 4 mouths? When he returned home, his mother had brought back only a handful of stale ends, hard bread from the day before, given out with an apologetic shake of the head from Mrs. Keegan. Maeve chewed her piece slowly, her eyes on the window. "The priest said there's talk of a soup kitchen opening near the docks," their mother murmured. "They'll serve anyone. It might be thin, but it's something." Patrick nodded, though part of him wondered how long the city would rely on thin soup and broken promises. That evening, as the light faded to a damp dusk, Patrick slipped out again. He told himself it was just a walk to keep warm, but his feet carried him back toward the docks. The soldiers were still there, their coats pulled tight, their eyes wary. The ship from before was nearly empty now, its crates loaded, its ropes coiled for departure. But the men, the ones who had been watching, were there too. More of them this time. He saw them near the warehouse, talking low, their faces serious. The scarred man noticed him again, and this time he did not look away. He took a step forward, just one, and Patrick froze. "You've been watching," the man said, his voice rough but not unkind. "What's your name, lad?" Patrick swallowed. "Patrick," he said carefully. "Patrick," the man repeated, as if testing the sound. "You've got eyes. Good ones. Eyes that see what's happening." Patrick didn't answer. The man crouched a little, bringing his scarred face closer. "Your family's hungry, isn't it? Everyone's is. And they send the food away." Patrick shifted his weight, unsure if this was a question or a trap. "There'll come a time soon," the man said, his voice low enough that the soldiers nearby would not hear, "when those who watch will have to choose. To keep watching or to act." Before Patrick could speak, the man straightened and turned back to his group. They moved away, swallowed by the fog rolling in off the river. Patrick stood there a long while after they were gone, his breath hanging in the cold air. He didn't understand what they planned or what they wanted from him, but he felt the weight of it pressing against his chest as he walked home. That night his father returned, empty-handed, hollow-eyed, his coat damp from rain. He said little, only that there was no work, not now, not in the weeks to come. They ate their stale bread in silence, each bite echoing in the small room. And then, as the wind howled outside and the fire sank low, there came a knock at the door. 3 times. Slow. Heavy. His mother froze, her hand halfway to the kettle. His father looked at the door, but did not move. Patrick stood, heart thudding, and reached for the latch. On the other side stood the scarred man. The scarred man stood there with the rain clinging to his coat, drops rolling down the deep line that marked his cheek. Behind him, the street was quiet except for the distant rattle of a cart and the softest of drizzle on the cobblestones. Patrick hesitated with his hand on the latch. His mother rose from her chair, her shawl pulled tight, her eyes sharp with both fear and curiosity. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't step inside. He glanced past Patrick into the dim room, saw the low fire, the thin faces, the stale bread on the table. "Evening," he said, his voice rough but steady. "I'm not here to harm you." His father finally stirred. "Then why knock at this hour?" he asked, his tone guarded. "We've no food to spare, and no coins either." "I'm not after your food," the man said. "I'm after your ears." Patrick frowned. "Why me?" he asked. The man looked at him a long moment. "Because you've been watching," he said simply. "You've seen what's happening." Patrick felt the room hold its breath. His mother stepped closer to the door now, the flicker of the fire catching in her eyes. "And what is happening?" she asked. The man shifted, rain dripping from his coat to the threshold. "Ships full of grain, meat, flour, leaving. Not for you, not for your children, for them." He tilted his head toward the dark stretch of street where the richer quarters lay. "Every sack that leaves means another night like this for you." His father's jaw tightened. "You speak as if that's new. We've known it for years." "It's worse now," the man said, leaning a little closer. "And there are those who mean to stop it." The words hung in the cold air between them. "Stop it." Patrick felt a shiver run up his back, though it wasn't from the damp. His mother folded her arms. "You should go. If the soldiers find you here saying such things." "They won't," the man interrupted gently. "Not tonight." He reached into his coat and pulled out something small, wrapped in coarse cloth. He placed it on the table just inside the door. "A loaf," he said. "Not much, but will fill your bellies better than that crust." Patrick's eyes widened. His sister stirred from the cot, the smell of the bread pulling her half awake. His father stared at the loaf. "Nothing is free," he said, his voice low. The man gave a faint, humorless smile. "No, nothing is. But tonight I ask only this, watch. Listen, there will be more nights like this one. And when the time comes, you'll know." Before anyone could answer, he turned, his boots splashing in the shallow puddles, and disappeared into the mist. Patrick closed the door slowly, his hands trembling slightly. His mother stood for a long while staring at the bread. Maeve climbed from her cot, rubbing her eyes. "Who was it?" she asked softly. "No one you need to know," their mother murmured, but the words sounded thin, like paper held too close to a flame. They ate the bread that night, slowly, carefully, as though it might vanish if they swallowed too fast. It was coarse but soft, and for a moment, the warmth of it spread through their small home like a memory of better times. But Patrick couldn't stop thinking of the man, of the look in his eyes, of the way he spoke, as if something had already begun. The next day, Dublin was restless. News of the warehouse raid spread from mouth to mouth, growing with each telling. Some said it was boys from the lanes. Others swore it was a band of workers from the mills. The merchants called for tighter watch. The poor whispered of hidden hands and secret bread. Patrick walked the streets with his father, who went door to door asking for work. The answers were always the same. Not now. Maybe later. Try again when the ships return. Men stood idle on corners, waiting for day labor that never came. Children carried buckets of water for a penny, their feet red from the cold stones. Near the quay, the soldiers had doubled their patrol. Their boots struck hard against the cobbles, their muskets slung across their backs. Patrick saw them turn away, an old woman who begged for scraps from the departing ship. She clutched her shawl tight and shuffled off, her eyes wet with something more than rain. The scar man was nowhere in sight that day, but Patrick saw traces, eyes watching from alleyways, a crate shifted in a doorway, a hand that lingered too long on a latch before slipping away. That evening, their father returned with news. A meeting was being whispered about in the north side lanes. Not for children, he said. Not for women either. Only men who were tired of waiting. Patrick listened from the corner, his hands folded tight in his lap. He didn't ask if his father would go. The question hung there anyway. That night, sleep came in fits. The city was alive, even in the dark. Footsteps on wet stones, a distant cry, the faint echo of a horse pulling a cart long after the hour when honest carts should run. Patrick rose once to peer out the window. Across the street, a figure slipped between the shadows, pausing at doors, tapping softly before moving on. In the morning, the news was louder, another raid. This time, barrels of flour gone from the storehouses by the river. The merchants fumed, the soldiers barked, and the poor, they murmured, some with worry, some with something that almost sounded like pride. Maeve clung to Patrick's arm as they walked to fetch water. "Will they find them?" she whispered. "I don't know," Patrick said. "Maybe they don't want to." She frowned. "Who?" "The ones looking," he said simply. The frost had gone, replaced by a steady drizzle that slicked the streets and left the air tasting of iron. Patrick passed the church where the priest still handed out bread, though the line was longer now and the loaves smaller. He passed the market where merchants shouted louder, but buyers came fewer. And all the while he felt it, that pull, that waiting tension like a storm building over the sea. At home, his mother folded the last of their firewood and said nothing. His father sat by the window, his jaw set, his eyes far away. That night there was no knock, but Patrick dreamed of one. The days that followed slipped by in a slow, heavy rhythm. Dublin streets seemed to sag under the weight of hunger and rain. Every morning the air hung damp and gray, and the sound of hooves on cobblestones mixed with the faint cries of traders trying to sell what little they had. Patrick found himself walking those streets more than ever, watching faces, hearing fragments of conversations he wasn't meant to hear. There was always talk now about the missing grain, the rising prices, the soup kitchens running dry. Some said the government would send help soon. Others laughed bitterly at the idea, saying they had heard that before. Maeve stayed close to their mother, her small hands often tucked in the woman's shawl to keep warm. Their father disappeared most days in search of work or charity, his shoulders hunched, his steps slower than they once were. At night, the family gathered around the fading fire, sharing whatever scraps could be found. A crust of bread, a cup of weak tea, a bit of boiled cabbage if they were lucky. The house always smelled of damp wood now, and the walls seemed to draw in closer as winter deepened. Patrick couldn't stop thinking of the scarred man and his quiet promise. The man had not returned, but his shadow felt stretched across the city. There were more soldiers now, their boots leaving black streaks of mud in the lanes. At the same time, there were more whispers, men standing close in the markets, women exchanging knowing looks at the water pumps, boys like Patrick lingering at corners where strangers came and went. One cold afternoon, as the fog rolled off the Liffey, Patrick followed the sound of a small crowd near the docks. A preacher stood on an overturned crate, his Bible open, his voice sharp with urgency. He spoke of patience, of endurance, of trusting that the famine would pass if only people kept their faith and obeyed the law. But not everyone listened with bowed heads. A few men at the back murmured to one another, their arms crossed, their faces set like stone. Patrick caught sight of the same rough scarf he had seen before, the one worn by the scarred man's companion. He ducked his head and moved on, but the feeling of being part of something larger, something hidden, stayed with him. At home that evening, their mother tried to keep their thoughts on smaller things. She spoke of an aunt who lived in the country, how the air there was cleaner, how sometimes they still had milk and butter. If the roads were safer, she murmured, we might send for her. But the roads were not safe. Travelers spoke of being turned back, of sickness in the villages, of fields blackened with rot. Even if they left, there was no guarantee of food waiting. The city carried its hunger like a secret everyone knew, but no one named too loudly. Merchants boarded their windows earlier now, and guards were stationed at the larger storehouses through the night. Yet somehow, food still vanished. A baker's wagon was found empty one dawn, its wheels broken, its horses gone. A mill on the north side reported sacks, missing from its loft. No one claimed to have seen anything, but in the poorer lanes, children had crumbs on their lips that no one remembered giving them. Patrick wondered who decided where that food went. Was it the scar man? Was a whole band of men like him? Or was it many small hands, each taking just enough to survive one more night? He thought of the loaf left at their door and the way his mother had eaten in silence, her eyes downcast, knowing the gift was not one that could be spoken of. One night, as the wind howled and the shutters banged, Patrick lay awake listening to his father and mother whisper. Their voices were low, tense, heavy with words that didn't quite reach him. He caught pieces. Meeting, too dangerous, they're saying more will come. His father's voice was rougher now, thinner from the cold air and empty stomach. His mother's was tired but sharp, the way a blade stays sharp even when worn. The next morning, Patrick found his father staring at the window before dawn, as if waiting for the street itself to give him an answer. You're up early, Patrick said softly. His father didn't turn. Too much to think about, he replied. Will it get better? Patrick asked. His father allowed a slow breath. If it doesn't, he said, we'll have to find a way to live with what's coming. Those words stayed with Patrick all day. They echoed as he passed the market stalls where turnips cost more than a man earned in 2 days. They echoed as he saw a child his own age begging for a coal cinder to warm his hands. They echoed as he watched soldiers march in pairs, their eyes scanning every doorway. The city was changing not with sudden thunder, but with a slow, steady grind. People learned to keep secrets. Families learned to trade favors instead of coins. The line between thief and neighbor blurred, and the line between law and survival grew thinner with each night. Maeve noticed it too. "Everyone walks faster now," she said one evening as they waited for their father. "Like they don't want to be seen." Patrick nodded. Maybe they don't. The Scar Man had become a ghost of sorts in their home. His name was never said, his visit never mentioned, but his presence lingered. Patrick sometimes thought he saw him in the mist, a shadow leaning against a wall, a figure slipping around a corner. Sometimes he wondered if the man watched him on purpose, or if it was only his own curiosity drawing their paths together. Then came word of sickness near the docks, a fever that spread quick in the damp alleys, carried by those too weak to fight it. The talk of food raids gave way to talk of death carts and closed doors. Patrick's mother scrubbed their steps with lye water and told them not to wander far. But still the hunger grew. One late afternoon, Patrick walked by the river and found the quay strangely quiet. No preachers, no shouting merchants, only the soft lap of water against stone and the distant cry of gulls. A few crates stood stacked, unguarded for once, and he caught himself staring at them longer than he should have. They were marked with a seal he didn't recognize, but the smell that drifted from one cracked lid was unmistakable, grain, fresh and full. He turned quickly away, feeling the heat rise in his face. He had not touched it, but the thought was already dangerous. When he reached home, his father was not yet back. His mother was mending a sleeve, her fingers moving slow. Maeve sat by the fire, tracing shapes in the ash with a stick. "Was it busy?" his mother asked without looking up. "Quieter than before," Patrick said. "Too quiet." She glanced at him then, as if the words held more than they said. That night, the wind carried a new sound through the streets. A bell, rung slowly, warning of something unseen. Neighbors spoke through cracks in their shutters. A man hurried past their window with a bundle under his coat. Dogs barked somewhere far away. Patrick lay awake long after Maeve had fallen asleep, the faint smell of damp grain still in his nose, the weight of the city pressing close. Somewhere out there, men moved in the dark, and ships waited for dawn. Somewhere out there, choices were being made that would shape the streets he walked. And he, though only a boy, felt himself being pulled toward that unseen tide, one step at a time. Patrick stepped aside to let the Scar Man in. The cold wind rushed past him and swirled into their small room as the man closed the door behind him. He removed his cap, nodded at Patrick's mother, and glanced at his father, who sat hunched over the dying fire. For a moment, no one spoke. Only the sound of the wind scraping along the rooftops filled the silence. The man placed something on the table, a bundle wrapped in cloth. "It's not much," he said quietly, "but it'll help for a night or two." Inside were 2 rough loaves of bread and a small wedge of cheese, dry at the edges but still food worth something in these streets. Maeve's eyes widened. She reached out, but hesitated, looking to her mother for permission. Their mother nodded once, her voice soft with a mix of gratitude and wariness. "Why are you doing this?" The scarred man didn't answer straight away. He warmed his hands near the fading coals. "Because no one else will," he said at last. "I've seen too many families go hungry while carts full of grain roll past the gates. I've seen good men beg for work, good women trade their last rings for crumbs. This city," he paused, his jaw tight, "it's being hollowed out." Patrick watched him closely, sensing there was more behind those words than pity. His father finally spoke, his voice rough from cold and weariness. "And what do you want in return? No one gives away food for nothing." The man turned his scarred face toward him, the firelight flickering in his eyes. "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight you eat. But soon, things will change. People are tired of waiting for mercy from those who have plenty. The streets are restless. Men are talking." Patrick's mother frowned. Talking leads to trouble. Trouble leads to soldiers. We've enough to bear without bringing that on our heads. The man didn't argue. He simply stood, pulling his coat tighter. Understand, he said. But when the time comes, you may have to choose between starving quiet and standing hungry but proud. Before anyone could answer, he slipped out into the dark, leaving the door swinging slightly in the wind. Patrick stared after him long after he was gone, his thoughts tangled like the ropes on the docks. That night, they ate the bread slowly, savoring each bite. The cheese was sharp but rich, a taste Patrick had nearly forgotten. Maeve fell asleep with crumbs still clinging to her fingers. Their father stared at the ceiling, saying nothing. In the days that followed, the streets of Dublin grew heavier with whispers. Bread lines stretched longer, and the price of a single loaf climbed again. The soup kitchen near the docks did open, but the pot ran dry before half the crowd was served. Patrick went with his mother once, holding Maeve's hand as they waited in the bitter cold, only to be turned away when the cauldron scraped empty. At night, he heard more knocking on doors, more quiet meetings at the edges of alleys. The scar man's face appeared in his thoughts often, as if those rough lines and steady eyes carried something more than warning, something like a promise. One afternoon, while running an errand for Mrs. Keegan, Patrick passed by the market square and saw a small group of soldiers unloading sacks from a wagon. People watched with hollow eyes as the sacks were carried inside a storehouse marked with the landlord's crest. For export, someone muttered, "Not a grain left for us." A child no older than Maeve tried to dart close, perhaps hoping to grab a handful of spilled oats. A soldier shoved him back hard enough that he fell in the mud. No one stepped forward to help. They only turned away, their shoulders stiff, their mouths pressed tight. Patrick walked faster, his heart knocking against his ribs. It wasn't just hunger anymore. It was the way people were starting to look at each other, less like neighbors and more like survivors fighting for scraps. That evening, as a weak drizzle settled over the city, Patrick found his father sitting on the step outside their home. The man's face looked older than his years, the lines deepened by worry. "Your mother's inside," he said. "She doesn't want to hear it, but I think trouble's coming." Patrick didn't ask how he knew. He only sat beside him, their shoulders barely touching. "Do you think the man with the scar is part of it?" he asked quietly. His father gave a dry laugh. "I think men like him show up when the world starts to crack. And cracks let all sorts of things through, good and bad." Inside, the room felt colder than before, even with a small fire burning. Maeve traced shapes on the window with her finger, watching the fog blur the lamps outside. Their mother hummed softly as she mended a tear in her shawl, though her eyes were far away. Later, as they prepared to sleep, Patrick heard another knock. Not heavy this time, just a quick rap against the frame. He peeked through the gap and saw a slip of paper wedged in the door. No one in sight. He unfolded it by the fading firelight. 3 words, scrawled in rough charcoal. "Tomorrow. Dockside Bridge." He hid the note beneath a loose stone in the floor before anyone could see. The morning crept in slow and gray, with the kind of damp chill that made the bones ache before the feet even touched the floor. Patrick woke early, the note still heavy in his thoughts. He stared at the small crack in the boards where he had hidden it, wondering if it would have been wiser to throw it into the fire. His mother stirred in the other room, humming faintly as she wrapped Maeve's thin shawl around her shoulders. His father had left before dawn, muttering about finding work again, though Patrick doubted there was any left to find. The dockside bridge wasn't far, just past the market and the row of warehouses where the river curved. He told himself he'd only go to look, to see if anyone would even be there. The note had no name, no promise, no threat. But something in the man's voice that night, the way his scar caught the firelight, kept pulling Patrick forward. He left after the weak morning meal, a crust dipped in watered broth, and walked through streets already filling with the sound of wheels and shouts. The market smelled of damp straw and desperation. Women argued over scraps of vegetable. Men leaned against walls with empty hands, hoping someone might need them to lift a sack or sweep a floor. The city felt thinner with each passing day, like the fog that clung to the riverbanks. When Patrick reached the bridge, the tide was low, revealing dark stones slick with river weed. A gull perched on a rotting post, its cry sharp in the cold air. At first, he thought no one had come, but then he saw a figure leaning against the far railing, coat collar turned up, cap pulled low. The scarred man. "You came," the man said without turning. "Good." Patrick stayed a few steps back. "Why did you leave the note? What do you want with me?" The man faced him now, his expression unreadable. "Not just you, lad. There are many like you, eyes open, bellies empty. This city won't feed you. It's too busy filling ships for other shores. But there are ways to change that." Patrick's stomach tightened. "You mean stealing?" The man's mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile. "I mean surviving. I mean taking back what's already ours." Before Patrick could ask more, two other men joined them from the fog, carrying a burlap sack between them. The shape inside shifted, a barrel, maybe, or something like it. They nodded to the scarred man and kept walking toward the warehouses. "Tonight," the man said to Patrick, his voice low, "there will be food taken off one of those ships before it sails. Not for profit, for the people. Bread, oats, maybe even flour. It'll be shared among the families who need it most. You want your mother and sister to eat? This is how it starts." Patrick felt a chill that wasn't from the wind. "And if the soldiers catch you?" "Then they'll call it theft," the man said. "But what do you call it when they take our grain and leave us to starve?" Patrick had no answer. His fingers clenched in his coat pockets, feeling the rough edges of his nails. The city bells tolled the noon hour, and the sound carried across the water like a warning. The man reached into his coat and handed Patrick a small token, a flat piece of wood, scratched with a simple mark. "If you choose to come, bring this. If not, burn it. No harm done." He turned away then, leaving Patrick on the bridge with the gray river flowing beneath. The gull screamed once more and lifted off into the mist. On his way home, Patrick passed the bakery where once the smell of fresh loaves would make his stomach growl with hope. Now the shutters were half closed, and the only bread on the shelf was too dear for anyone he knew. Mrs. Keegan waved to him from her doorway, her apron dusted with flour. "Your mother still wants more rags mended?" she asked. "Tomorrow, maybe," Patrick said, forcing a smile. But his thoughts were far away. At home, Maeve sat by the window, coughing softly into her sleeve. Their mother stirred a pot of weak cabbage broth, the smell more sour than rich. "No word from your father?" Patrick asked. She shook her head. "He said the docs might have work. I fear he'll come back with nothing but cold in his coat." That evening, as the sky turned the color of smoke, Patrick sat by the fire with the token in his hand. The mark on it was crude, but it felt heavy all the same. He thought of the men with the sack, of the way the soldiers had shoved the child in the mud, of Maeve's thin wrists wrapped in her shawl. Hunger had a way of making choices where none should be. When the house grew quiet, he slipped the token back into his pocket and lay awake, listening to the city breathe its uneasy sleep. Night crept over Dublin with a wet, heavy fog that clung to the cobblestones and swallowed the light from the few gas lamps that still burned. Patrick lay on his straw mattress, staring at the low ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of his mother's sewing and the soft wheeze of Maeve's breathing beside him. The token pressed against his chest, where he had tucked it into his shirt. He turned it over and over between his fingers, the rough edge catching on his skin. Each pass of his thumb felt like a question. He could hear the faint rumble of carts moving down toward the river and the distant bark of a soldier's voice cutting through the damp night air. The docks never truly slept anymore. There were too many shipments leaving, too many watchful eyes guarding crates that once would have fed the streets. Patrick thought of the scarred man's words, bread, oats, flour, spoken with the weight of a promise and the risk of a threat. When the house finally settled into silence, he rose. The floorboards creaked softly, but his mother did not stir. He pulled on his coat and stepped out, closing the door as gently as he could. The cold bit at his cheeks as he walked. The city around him stretched thin between hunger and unrest. A dog nosed at a heap of rags in an alley, and two men whispered near a shuttered tavern. Patrick kept his head down. The dockside bridge loomed ahead, its stones slick with mist. A shadow stepped from the fog. One of the men from before, Not the scarred one, but another with sharp eyes and a scarf pulled high over his mouth. "You brought the token?" he asked quietly. Patrick nodded and held it up. The man gestured for him to follow. They moved through narrow lanes until the river opened before them, dark and restless. A ship sat moored, its deck dimly lit by a few oil lamps. Crates were stacked on the pier, marked with symbols Patrick couldn't read. The air smelled of damp rope and grain. Others were already there, faces half hidden, movements quick but careful. Patrick caught a glimpse of a woman handing out burlap sacks and a boy not much older than him, carrying a bundle toward the shadows. The scarred man stood at the edge, his hands behind his back, watching everything with a sharp, still gaze. "You came," he said as Patrick approached. "Good. No one's asking you to steal, only to help carry what's already being taken." Patrick hesitated. "What happens if the soldiers find us?" The man's eyes softened for a moment. "Then you run. You're quick enough for that, aren't you?" Before Patrick could answer, a low whistle cut through the night. Men began to move, lifting crates, cutting ropes, shifting sacks into waiting carts hidden in the mist. Patrick grabbed one end of a sack, his fingers numb from the cold, and followed a line of others toward a back alley. The weight was rough against his shoulder, but the thought of bread in his sister's hands kept him steady. Not everyone agreed with what was happening. From across the street, a woman shouted at them to stop, her voice shrill in the fog. "You'll bring the soldiers. You'll bring them down on all of us," she cried. But no one turned. Hunger drowned out warning. Halfway through their work, a sound split the night. A boot striking the cobblestone, the metallic rattle of a musket. "Halt!" A soldier barked, his voice sharp. Another followed, then another. The men scattered, melting into alleys, dragging their loads with them. Patrick's heart pounded as he ducked behind a barrel, the sack still in his grip. He could see the soldiers' silhouettes moving against the dim light, their coats gleaming with damp. The scarred man didn't run. He stepped forward, hands raised just enough to look harmless. "Evening, officer," he called out calmly, just shifting what was left to spoil. The soldier narrowed his eyes. "By whose order?" The man didn't answer. The silence stretched, heavy as the river mist. Patrick felt a hand grip his shoulder, one of the other boys. "Go," he whispered, and together they slipped into the maze of alleys, leaving the docks behind. By the time Patrick reached his home, the sack was half torn and his arms ached. Inside, the room was dark but warm. His mother stirred as he placed the sack by the hearth. "Patrick," she whispered, her voice a mix of fear and relief. "Where did you?" "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "there'll be bread." She said nothing more, only pressed her hands together as if in prayer. Outside, the city was still awake. Soldiers' boots echoed on distant stones, and somewhere near the river, a whistle blew 3 times. The morning after the dockside raid came with a sharp wind that rattled the shutters and cut through the narrow lanes like a knife. Patrick woke to the smell of bread warming over the fire. It was a smell he hadn't known in weeks, thick and real, filling the room with something close to hope. Maeve sat cross-legged near the hearth, her eyes bright despite the cold, as their mother sliced a small loaf into thin pieces. Each slice was careful, measured, as though the bread were gold. "Where did this come from?" she asked quietly, not looking at him. Patrick hesitated, the memory of the night heavy in his chest. "Someone gave it," he said. "Someone who thinks we shouldn't go hungry." His mother glanced at him, her eyes sharp for a moment, then softened. "Sometimes help comes with a price," she murmured. "Sometimes it's a debt you don't know you owe." His father hadn't returned. The corner where his coat usually hung was empty, and the house felt thinner without his heavy steps. Patrick chewed his piece of bread slowly, listening to the faint hum of the city outside, the clatter of wheels, the creak of carts, the hollow echo of soldiers' boots on wet stone. By noon, the whispers had started. A baker down the street muttered that a shipment was missing. A woman at the pump said soldiers had blocked off part of the docks. Some said it was thieves, others said it was hungry men, and still others claimed it was a sign of something bigger. Trouble coming, trouble that might spill over every doorstep before the month was through. Patrick tried to keep his head low, but the streets had eyes, and they were searching now. He noticed the soldiers moving in pairs, their rifles glinting beneath their damp coats, their faces harder than before. The landlord's men, too, were out, checking doorways, asking questions that sounded casual but weren't. Mrs. Keegan pulled him aside as he passed her stoop. "You hear the talk?" she asked in a hushed tone. "They say the Crown's sending more troops if this goes on. They'll close the markets, shut the roads. Mark my words." Patrick nodded, though his stomach tightened. He thought of the scarred man, standing calm in the fog while soldiers closed in. He thought of the token he had burned in the hearth that morning, watching the black mark curl into ash. It didn't matter. Some choices leave a trace, even when the sign is gone. That night, his mother stitched by the fire again, the needle catching in the lamplight. Maeve curled against her, already dozing. Patrick sat near the window, watching the dark. The city sounded different now. Too quiet in some places, too quick in others, as though it were holding its breath. A faint tap at the door made them all look up. Just one, soft and quick. Patrick's mother frowned. "Who calls at this hour?" she whispered. Patrick opened the door a crack. A boy stood there, younger than him, with red hair plastered by the drizzle. He shoved a folded scrap into Patrick's hand and vanished into the alley. The note was short, the same rough charcoal marks. "Keep watch. They're asking names." Patrick closed the door and locked it. His mother watched him, her face pale. "What is it?" "Nothing," he said. "Just nothing." But that night he dreamed of soldiers knocking at every door, of sacks torn open and bread spilled into the gutter, of his sister crying as boots thundered up their stairs. Days passed, and the tension thickened like smoke. The docks were guarded now. 2 lines of soldiers posted where the mist once drifted free. The market grew thinner, the bread dearer, and the soup kitchen closed 2 days for lack of supplies. Men whispered in corners. Women clutched their baskets closer, and children went to sleep with empty bellies while ships sailed heavy down the river. The scarred man was seen again, near the old church where the stones wept with damp. Some said he was planning another raid. Others said he was gathering names of those willing to risk a beating or worse for a sack of grain. Patrick heard his name mentioned in a whisper once, but when he turned, the voices were gone. One evening, as the wind howled low across the rooftops, Patrick found his father sitting on the stoop again, his face drawn and gray. "They're watching," he said. "Men with questions. Not just soldiers. Landlord's men, too. They want to know who moved the food." Patrick's heart stumbled in his chest. "And if they ask you?" His father looked at him, then really looked, as if seeing the boy he was and the shadow he might become. "I tell them I know nothing," he said. "Because I don't. And even if I did," he stopped, the words trailing into the cold. Patrick wanted to ask if hunger could make a man a criminal, or if mercy could make one too. But the question stayed behind his teeth. That night, a single lamp burned in the window across the lane. It was the sign they had whispered about at the bridge, a signal for those who would come, or those who had already chosen. Patrick watched it flicker against the fog, his hands clenched tight on the windowsill, and wondered which door the soldiers would knock on first. The following morning began with a dull sky, the kind that made the city feel as though it were trapped between night and day. The streets glistened with a thin drizzle, and the cobblestones carried the smell of damp soot. Patrick stepped outside with a pail to fetch water. The lane was quiet, too quiet for that hour, and when he reached the pump, 2 soldiers were already there, their coats buttoned to the neck, their rifles slung but ready. One of them glanced at him, then back to his companion. "Name?" the taller soldier asked. Patrick hesitated. "Patrick Doyle," he said, his voice even. The soldier scribbled something into a small book, then waved him off. "Tell your family to keep the peace," he muttered. "There's talk in these streets." Patrick carried the pail back with his hands trembling slightly. His mother looked up as he entered. "Did they stop you?" she asked. He nodded. "They're writing names now." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she set the kettle aside. "Keep your head low, Patrick. We've little enough as it is. No more questions. No more wandering." But wandering was how he had found bread, and wandering was how he had seen what most turned away from, the way hunger was bending people into something they didn't want to be. It wasn't just the docks anymore. Rumors spread of wagons stopped on the outskirts, of storehouses opened in the night and emptied before dawn. And with each act came another soldier, another closed street, another whisper that the city would soon choke on its own fear. That evening, Patrick went to Mrs. Keegan's with a bundle of torn rags his mother had finished mending. The old woman gave him a few coins, her hands trembling as she counted them. "They came here this morning," she whispered. "Two men, not soldiers, the landlord's men. Asked who's been out late. Asked if I'd seen boys with sacks near the bridge." Patrick kept his face still. "What did you tell them?" "That I see no more than I have to," she said, and closed the door behind him. On the way back, he saw the scarred man again. Not close, not waiting for him this time, but standing at the corner near the baker's alley. His coat was damp. His face turned toward a group of women arguing over the price of a single loaf. For a moment their eyes met, and in that brief glance, Patrick thought he saw something like warning, or maybe a question. "Will you keep standing still?" He hurried home without a word. That night, his father returned with a bruise along his jaw. "Word's gone," he said flatly, "and now they're questioning every man who's been near the river after dark." His mother's hands tightened on the pot she was stirring. "Patrick," she said softly, "if anyone comes asking, you say nothing. You hear me? Nothing." Patrick nodded, but the words felt thin in the air. Outside, a cart rumbled past, its wheels muffled by the damp, and somewhere a dog barked and then fell silent. Over the next days, the grip on the city grew tighter. Soldiers posted at the bridges. Lanterns lit along the main streets, even in the early hours. The soup kitchen reopened for a single day, and Patrick stood in line with Maeve, only to be turned away when the pot ran dry once more. The children ahead of them went home with bowls half filled with a watery broth that smelled more of smoke than soup. At home, his mother tore the last loaf into pieces the size of her palm. "This will not last," she murmured. Maeve leaned her head against her arm, too tired to complain. That night, the lamp across the lane burned again, its faint glow cutting through the drizzle. Patrick sat by the window, heart tight, and wondered what the signal meant this time. Was it a warning? A call? Or the last flicker before the soldiers came? He thought of the boy who had brought the note, of the man with the scar and the promise of bread, of the cold look in the soldier's eyes as he wrote his name down at the pump. The city was closing its fist, and he was somewhere in the middle, trying not to be crushed. As midnight drew near, a noise stirred him from his thoughts, a rustle in the yard, the soft thud of a footstep. He crept to the door, every muscle tense. Through the crack, he saw a shadow move, quick and careful, then vanish into the alley. He waited a long time before opening the door. Nothing remained but the damp wind and a scrap of paper caught under a stone. He picked it up with cold fingers. The same rough hand, the same blunt words, "Tomorrow night. Decide." The next day brought a strange quiet to the street, the kind that felt heavier than any storm. The drizzle had turned into a fine mist that clung to every doorway and made the cobbles slick. Patrick moved about his chores with a hollow chest, carrying water, fetching scraps, and trying not to draw attention. The soldiers were everywhere, 2 by the market, 3 at the far end of the lane, 1 even standing watch near the old mill as if the bricks themselves had grown dangerous overnight. People walked with their heads down, their conversations clipped, their eyes darting at the sound of each cart rolling past. Maeve followed him that morning, her hands stuffed into her coat pockets. "You're going to see them again, aren't you?" she asked suddenly as they neared the pump. He glanced around before answering. "Who?" "The ones who leave the notes. The ones everyone pretends not to see." He didn't answer. She kept her gaze steady on him. "You think you're hiding it, Patrick, but you're not. I hear the steps outside our door at night. I see you reading those scraps." He sighed and set the bucket down. "Maeve, if you know, then you also know why I can't say more." She kicked a pebble across the wet stones. "They're going to make you choose. And when they do, it won't just be you who pays for it." Her words stayed with him all afternoon. Inside the tenement, the air was thick with the smell of damp clothes and boiled cabbage. His mother kept glancing toward the door as though she expected someone to knock at any moment. His father sat silent, rubbing at his jaw where the bruise had gone yellow. By dusk, The lamp on the far corner flickered again. One blink, then another. A pause. Two more. Patrick watched it through the small slit of the curtain. The same rhythm as before. The same signal. This time he didn't wait. He slipped his boots on, tucked the last scrap of bread from supper into his pocket, and stepped into the night. The rain had eased, leaving behind a sheen on the stones that caught every stray glimmer of light. The city felt like a waiting animal, tense, coiled, listening. At the alley near the baker's shop, the scarred man was waiting, his coat collar turned up. "You came," he said quietly. "Good." Patrick kept a small distance. "You keep leaving notes. You keep saying decide. What am I deciding?" The man's gaze swept the street. To stop watching and start acting. "You've seen the lines at the kitchen. You've seen the wagons that come and go. We can't beg anymore." Patrick's fists tightened at his sides. "And if I say no, then you keep watching," the man replied. "Until there's nothing left to watch." A figure moved behind him. One of the same men from before, the one with the sharp jaw and quick hands. He handed the scarred man a small bundle. The cloth unwrapped just enough for Patrick to see a flash of something white, flour, maybe, or salt. It smelled faintly of grain. His stomach nodded. "There's another shipment tonight," the scar man murmured. "By the South Quay. Soldiers will look the other way if the right men are paid. But the ones who truly need it, they never see a crumb." Patrick stared at the bundle. "And you want me to help take it? I want you to help set it right," the man said, his voice low but firm. "Not for me. For your sister. For your mother." A shout cracked down the street. All three of them stiffened. Lantern light bobbed at the far end. Two soldiers, moving quick, their boots slapping the wet stones. The scarred man shoved the bundle back into his coat and caught Patrick's shoulder. "Tomorrow night," he whispered. "South Quay. If you're not there, you'll wish you had been." Then they were gone, swallowed by the narrow dark of the alley, leaving Patrick alone with the rain and the sound of approaching boots. He turned for home, his heart pounding, his mind running in circles. If he went, he risked everything. If he didn't, they might starve anyway. Back in the tenement, Maeve was waiting at the window. "I saw you," she whispered when he slipped inside. "I saw them too." He sank onto the bench beside her. "If you did, then you know what this means." She hugged her knees to her chest. "It means you're already in too deep." The night stretched long, the hours marked by the drip of water in the eaves and the distant clatter of soldiers' boots. Patrick lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, the scarred man's words echoing, "Tomorrow night. Decide." When morning came, the city felt tighter still. Neighbors spoke in half sentences. Mrs. Keegan's shutters stayed closed. At the market, a cart overturned when a soldier shouted at a boy for running too fast. No one moved to help at first, not until the soldier left. By midday, whispers spread. Another raid at the docks, a warehouse emptied, guards bribed or bribing. No one knew. The lines at the soup kitchen doubled, but the pot did not. A mother fainted in the queue, her child clutching her skirt. Patrick went home with nothing but a crust wrapped in paper. His father stared at it in silence, then broke it into 3 pieces. That evening, the rain stopped, leaving the air thick and cold. Patrick stood by the door, his hand on the latch, the city outside waiting. Maeve watched him from the table. "You're going," she said. It wasn't a question. He nodded once. "Then come back," she whispered. "No matter what you find, come back." He slipped out into the night, the stones slick underfoot, the streets too quiet for comfort. Somewhere a dog barked and was silenced. Somewhere a lantern guttered in the wind. The South Quay lay ahead, dark against the river's black sheen. Figures moved in the shadows, too many to count, some with sacks, some with nothing but their hands. Patrick kept to the edge, his heart a tight knot. The scar man's voice carried low across the damp air. "Quickly now, before they change their minds." The river lapped quietly against the worn stones of the quay, its dark surface catching only faint shards of moonlight between the drifting clouds. Patrick hugged the wall, his breath slow and shallow, watching as shadows shifted near the warehouses. There was a smell of damp hemp and spoiled grain in the air, mixed with the faint metallic tang of rusted chains. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang from a church tower, its echo swallowed quickly by the heavy fog rolling in from the water. The scarred man emerged from the mist like he belonged to it, his steps silent, his eyes fixed on the cart that had just creaked to a stop near the loading bay. Two soldiers lingered at its side, their posture stiff but not hostile. One held a lantern low, the other looked over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear. Patrick saw the brief exchange of hands, a pouch passed, a nod given, and the soldiers moved off without another word. The cart remained, its cover damp, the outlines of sacks beneath it clear even in the dim light. Patrick's pulse quickened. This was the shipment they spoke of. Not for the hungry, not for the mothers waiting with hollow cheeks and children pressed to their skirts. This grain was leaving Dublin by dawn, headed to the ports where profit outweighed mercy. The scarred man turned, catching Patrick's eyes in the dark. He motioned once, "Come closer." Patrick stepped forward, the cobbles slick underfoot, his heart thudding with each movement. Around him, more figures emerged. Thin men with weathered faces, a young girl carrying a coil of rope, even an older dockhand who had worked the river his whole life. Their eyes all carried the same glint. Not hope, not yet, but a kind of desperate readiness. "Tonight decides more than you think," the scarred man whispered when Patrick came near. "We don't take all. We take enough to remind them that we still breathe." Patrick looked at the sacks. "And if they come?" "They will," the man said simply. "But they cannot catch everyone." The mist thickened, curling around their boots. Somewhere upriver, a whistle blew. Sharp, warning, too soon. The dockhand swore under his breath. "They're ahead of schedule." "Move," the scar man hissed. Hand shot forward. Ropes unfurled. The first sack came free, then another. Patrick found himself hauling with them, the coarse fabric biting into his fingers. Each sack felt heavier than the last, each moment stretching thin as the night itself. Somewhere down the quay, boots struck stone, steady, marching closer. Maeve's words echoed in his mind. "They're going to make you choose." He chose to keep lifting. The first shout cracked through the fog. A soldier's voice, rough and commanding. Then another shout, closer this time, followed by the clatter of a dropped lantern. Lights spilled across the mist, cutting strange, sharp shapes through the air. Men scattered, their shadows leaping on the walls. "Leave it," someone cried. "Take what you can and run." Patrick grabbed the nearest sack, slinging it over his shoulder, the weight nearly knocking him to his knees. He stumbled toward the alley where the scarred man had pointed earlier. Behind him, boots hammered the stones, shouts growing louder. The river, once silent, now sounded like a drumbeat against the quay. A figure loomed out of the fog, a soldier with his bayonet drawn. For a heartbeat, Patrick froze, his grip tightening on the sack. The soldier's eyes met his, young, pale, startled. Neither moved. Then a crash from the left. A barrel overturned. The soldier turned, his shout half swallowed by the noise, and Patrick slipped past him, boots skidding on the wet ground. The alley narrowed, walls slick with moisture. He could hear the others ahead, ragged breaths, hurried footsteps. Somewhere to the right, a door slammed. Somewhere behind, a whistle shrilled again, this one closer, more urgent. Patrick's lungs burned. The sack dug into his shoulder, its weight a cruel reminder of why he was here. For Maeve. For his mother. For all those hollow eyes in the queue. He turned the corner and stopped short. The scarred man was there, standing beside an open wagon, his face lit by a single flickering lamp. "Throw it in," he barked. Patrick heaved the sack into the wagon. It landed with a dull thud, joining a small heap already there. The wagon was no grand rescue, just enough to feed a few streets for a few days. But in that moment, it looked like salvation. "Go," the scar man snapped. "Back the way you came." "What about you?" Patrick asked. The man didn't answer. His eyes darted past Patrick, toward the growing noise behind. "Go!" Patrick hesitated only a heartbeat, then turned and ran. The mist was thicker now, wrapping around him like a wet cloth. He could hear the chaos unfolding, the clash of orders, the pound of boots, the desperate scrabble of hands trying to take what little could be saved. As he neared the edge of the quay, he saw movement in the fog ahead. A figure stepped out. Maeve. His heart lurched. "What are you doing here?" "I followed you," she whispered, her breath quick. "I couldn't stay home. Not tonight." He grabbed her hand. "We have to move." But the street beyond was no longer empty. Soldiers were spreading out, their lanterns swinging, their boots slick with rain. One of them shouted, pointing in their direction. Maeve's fingers tightened in his. "Patrick!" He looked left, then right. The river loomed dark to their side, the warehouses shut tight to the other. The path was closing fast. From somewhere deep in the mist came a cry, not of anger, but of pain. A gun cracked, its echo sharp against the stones. Patrick pulled Maeve into the shadow of a broken archway. His chest rose and fell, his mind racing. Every choice seemed wrong. Every step carried weight. And still, above the river's murmur and the soldiers' shouts, the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. The fog thickened until it felt like the city itself was holding its breath, every stone, every window watching silently as the night unraveled. Patrick pressed his back against the cold wall, feeling Maeve's trembling hand clutch his sleeve. The footsteps of the soldiers echoed closer, a steady rhythm that set his pulse racing. Lantern light bobbed through the haze, sometimes vanishing, sometimes flaring up suddenly like a ghostly warning. Each flicker seemed to bring the world a step nearer to breaking apart. From the archway, he could see the edge of the quay where the wagon had been. The sacks were gone. The scarred man had vanished. But scattered across the wet stones were the marks of hurried work. Rope ends, torn cloth, a trail of flour leading toward the narrow alleys of the old fish market. It was enough to betray them if the soldiers had sharp eyes. Enough to undo all they had risked. Maeve whispered, "We can still get out. Through the tannery lane. No one goes there at night." Patrick shook his head slightly. "Too exposed. They'll have men there by now." She swallowed, her breath fogging in the cold air. "Then where?" He didn't answer. He was watching the soldiers as they split their group. 2 moved toward the quay, 3 fanned out along the upper street. One of them, a tall man with a heavy coat, paused and knelt to touch the flour-stained stones. His head lifted, sharp as a hound catching a scent. Patrick's chest tightened. They had minutes at most. A shout came from farther down. Someone else had been caught. The sound of a scuffle, the slam of a door, a muffled cry. The soldiers moved faster now, their lanterns cutting the mist like blades. Patrick pulled Maeve's hand. "This way." They slipped through the arch and into a narrow lane that smelled of rot and stagnant water. The stones here were uneven, some missing entirely, leaving puddles that gleamed faintly in the moonlight. Rats darted along the edges, vanishing into broken crates. The lane twisted twice, then opened into a courtyard choked with abandoned barrels. Here, for a moment, they paused to catch their breath. Patrick leaned against the damp wall, his heart thudding. Maeve sat on an upturned crate, her fingers still trembling. "They won't stop," she whispered. "Even if they don't find us tonight, they'll keep looking." "I know," he said quietly, "but we can't let them find the wagon." She looked up at him, her face pale in the dim light. "You think this will change anything? One wagon? One night?" Patrick's jaw tightened. "It might change who eats tomorrow." A sound interrupted them, a soft tap, deliberate, on the far wall of the courtyard. They both turned sharply. Out of the shadows stepped the scarred man. "You stayed too long," he said, his voice low but urgent. "They're closing the streets behind us." Patrick took a step forward. "Where's the wagon?" "Gone," the man replied. "But they'll follow the trail if we don't lead them somewhere else." Mae frowned. "You mean draw them off?" The man's eyes flicked toward Patrick. "Aye. Someone needs to take them another way. Buy us time." Patrick felt the cold seep deeper into his bones. "You want me to be the one they catch?" The scar man didn't answer, not directly. "You know these streets. You can vanish if you're quick." Maeve stood abruptly. "No, there has to be another way." But the soldiers were already closer. Their voices carried now, barking orders. The glow of lanterns licked the far edge of the courtyard. The scar man pressed a small bundle into Patrick's hands, a torn piece of cloth, smeared with flour, something that would mark him if seen. "Go east," he said, "toward the brewery. Let them follow. We'll take the rest upriver. Patrick stared at the cloth, then at Maeve. Her eyes were wide, desperate, pleading with him to refuse. Yet he remembered the cue that morning, the fainting mother, the hollow cheeks. He remembered the bundle of bread that barely fed them all. He shoved the cloth into his coat and turned. Go with him, he told Maeve. Stay hidden. If I'm not back by dawn. She grabbed his arm. Don't say that. Then make sure the bread gets home. The soldier's boots clattered closer. There was no more time. Patrick darted from the courtyard, his footsteps splashing through the shallow puddles. The night swallowed him, the fog closing like a curtain behind. Shouts rose almost instantly, a voice calling that someone had fled, another ordering the pursuit. He ran east, the wind cutting his cheeks, the narrow streets twisting like a maze. The city seemed to rearrange itself as he moved. Familiar alleys now full of barrels, doors that had always been open now barred. The mist thickened again, blinding him, muffling the sound of his own breath. Behind him, the chase grew louder. He turned a corner, slipped down a flight of slick steps, and found himself at the brewery wall. The smell of stale malt clung to the air, heavy and bitter. He pressed himself flat against the stone, listening. Boots struck the top of the steps. A lantern bobbed. The soldiers had followed the trail. One of them shouted. Another raised his light. Patrick's heart hammered. If he moved now, they'd see him. If he stayed, they'd find him. Somewhere far off, a bell began to toll. Not the slow, distant chime of midnight, but a sharp, urgent peal, calling men to their posts, calling the city to wakefulness. The soldiers quickened their steps. Patrick gripped the edge of the wall, the cold stones slick beneath his fingers. The river wasn't far. He could hear its slow, heavy rush. If he could reach the lower quay, he might lose them in the water's dark mirror. A voice rang out behind him. There! Don't let him get away! Lanterns flared, shadows stretched long, and the chase began in earnest. He ran. The mist tore past him, the stones blurred beneath his boots. His lungs burned with the cold night air. Every turn seemed to narrow. Every doorway seemed shut. Yet he kept running, the image of his sister's pale face pushing him forward. The footsteps behind were closer now, many, not few. A whistle shrieked again, sharper than before. Patrick darted left, down a passage that reeked of fish guts and old brine, his hands brushing the damp walls to steady himself. At the end of the lane, the river opened wide, black and silent. For a heartbeat, he paused. Then the soldiers' shouts broke the night once more. And in that moment, as the mist curled low over the water and the city held its breath, Patrick realized there was no path left that would not cost him something. The cold air stung Patrick's lungs as he crouched low by the river's edge, the damp stones slick beneath his boots. The shouts behind him grew sharper, echoing off the water like iron on iron. He could hear the soldiers fanning out, their boots hitting the cobbles in a rhythm that sent a chill through his chest. The mist hid him for now, but it also hid them. Every shadow felt like a threat, every flicker of light a warning. Maeve's face flashed in his mind, her eyes wide, her voice barely more than a whisper telling him to come back. He gripped the rough edge of the quay, the sound of the river beneath like a slow breath, steady and dark. Somewhere upriver, a bell tolled again, followed by another, as if the whole city had woken to the hunt. The bundle in his coat felt heavier than it should have. That scrap of cloth smeared with flour. It was proof, a trail marker, a reason for soldiers to keep chasing him while others slipped away with sacks of grain. That was the plan. That was the price. A lantern's glow cut through the mist, closer now, revealing the sharp outline of a rifle barrel. Patrick pressed himself flat against the wall, his breath held tight. Two soldiers passed just above him on the upper quay, their voices hushed but urgent. He went this way. Check the lower steps. If we lose him, it's our necks. Patrick edged along the wall, each step slow, each breath counted. The river lapped at the stones, its current sluggish but deep. He had one chance to reach the old rope bridge, if it was still there. If the boards hadn't rotted through. If the mist was thick enough to cover his retreat. A sharp whistle split the night. More boots. More voices. They were spreading like a net now, each alley filling with their presence. The city felt smaller with every step, as if it too was closing in on him. He darted across a narrow stretch of open stones, his shadow flickering under the lantern light. A shout rang out. Someone had seen him. Down by the river. There! The chase was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. Boots pounded behind him, the wet stones slick beneath their weight. Patrick's legs burned, but he didn't slow. He turned a corner, heart hammering, and there it was, the rope bridge. Its planks were dark with rot, its ropes frayed, swaying faintly over the black water. Beyond it lay the abandoned distillery, a maze of crumbling walls and empty vats where a boy could vanish if luck was kind. He ran for it. The first board creaked under his boot. The second groaned louder. Behind him, the soldiers reached the edge of the quay, their lanterns blazing, their shouts carrying over the water. Stop! In the name of the crown. Patrick didn't stop. He gripped the wet rope, each step a prayer that the wood would hold. The river moved sluggishly beneath, wide enough to swallow a man without sound. Halfway across, the bridge swayed, a board snapping with a splintered crack. He stumbled, catching himself with a desperate lunge. A shot rang out. The rope twanged where the bullet struck, fibers fraying. He ducked low, his breath sharp in the cold mist. Another shot tore through the fog, this one close enough to send splinters into his sleeve. He pushed on, feet slipping, hands burning against the coarse rope. The far side was only a few steps away when a voice barked an order behind him. Cut him off at the mill. More boots, more shadows moving fast. They weren't just chasing now, they were circling. If they reached the distillery's far side first, he'd be trapped. He leapt from the final board, landing hard on the damp stones. His legs shook under him, but he ran, past the crumbling wall, past the iron gate hanging on one hinge, into the hollow dark of the old distillery. The air inside was stale with dust and the ghosts of spilled malt. Vats loomed like giants in the mist, their rims broken, their insides empty. Stairs led up to a gantry where the shadows were deeper still. He climbed, boots silent on the warped boards, each creak sounding louder than thunder in his ears. Below, the soldiers entered, their lanterns cutting wild shapes across the walls. Search everything. He's here. Patrick pressed himself flat against the railing, watching as they spread out, their voices low, their steps cautious. He could see their breath in the cold air. He could smell the oil from their lamps. The scrap of cloth weighed heavy in his pocket. If they found it on him, they'd know. They'd know everything. The wagon, the grain, the faces in the mist. His fingers tightened on the railing. One step wrong, and it would all end here. A floorboard cracked beneath his weight. The sound echoed, sharp across the empty hall. A lantern swung up. There, on the gantry. Patrick bolted. The gantry shuddered under his sprint. The soldiers shouted, boots pounding on the stairs. A shot cracked again, the bullet sparking off the iron rail. He ran toward the far window, its glass long gone, only the frame remaining. Beyond it, the river gleamed faintly under the moonlight, and the city stretched dark and cold. Behind him, the soldiers climbed faster. He reached the window and hesitated. The drop was long, the stones below slick with moss. But staying meant capture. Staying meant the bundle in his coat would lead them back to everyone. The mist curled up like a hand, beckoning. He climbed onto the frame, his breath white in the cold air, his heart hammering so loud he could hardly hear the shouts anymore. And then a voice cut through the chaos. Not a soldier's, not harsh, but urgent, familiar. Patrick, jump! It came from below, from the shadows by the river's edge. He turned, trying to see, but the mist swallowed the figure whole. Another shot cracked the night. The window frame splintered under his hand. He had seconds to decide. Rain soaked the cobbled streets of Dublin as night stretched across the city like a damp cloak. The narrow lanes were darker now, quieter, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Mary clutched her shawl tighter, her steps quickening with the fear of being out after dark. Every alley whispered danger. Hunger had turned neighbors into strangers, and strangers into something worse. But she had no choice. Word had spread that a shipment of bread might arrive at dawn, and only those who waited by the river gates would have a chance to claim a portion. Hunger did not respect fear, nor did desperation sleep. In the distance, Seamus trudged along a parallel street, his boots leaving shallow impressions in the wet dirt. He had left the protest earlier than the others, slipping away when the crowd began to argue over who should lead the next march. He had grown tired of promises and speeches. None of them filled his stomach. None of them warmed his sister's hands. He needed answers, not rhetoric, and something about the rumors he had heard gnawed at him. Some said the grain shipments were being redirected, hidden in warehouses owned by men who profited from scarcity. Others said it was the government, using the famine as a lever to bend the city to its will. Seamus did not know which to believe, but tonight he would try to find out. Patrick, meanwhile, lingered near the old docks, his eyes scanning the waterline where barges sometimes moored without notice. He had overheard a conversation between two merchants days ago, something about a secret deal and a midnight exchange. His plan was simple: watch, listen, and return before dawn to share whatever he learned with the others. But as the mist thickened, he began to feel uneasy. The docks were too quiet, the air too heavy. It was as if the city wanted to hide its secrets beneath the fog. Back in the tenement, Nora lay awake beside her ailing mother, listening to the sound of distant footsteps and the occasional cart rolling over loose stones. The room smelled faintly of damp straw and smoke. She had sent her brother out with nothing but hope to guide him, and now she regretted it. What if something happened? What if the streets swallowed him like they had swallowed so many others? The fear of loss had become as common as hunger, and it lingered in every creak of the floorboards. As the hours dragged on, something stirred in the city's underbelly. Men with covered wagons moved quietly through back lanes, their wheels wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. They stopped near the southern quay, exchanging whispers with a cloaked figure whose face remained hidden. From the shadow of an old warehouse, Seamus watched, his heart pounding as he strained to catch their words. He caught fragments: shipment, not for them tomorrow night. It was enough to know that the food was not being distributed fairly, that someone was moving it for profit or power. But before he could slip away, a hand gripped his shoulder. Patrick had seen him first, emerging from the fog with the same idea burning in his eyes. "You followed the rumors too," Patrick murmured, his voice low. Seamus nodded. They stayed crouched together, watching as the wagons rolled on, their cargo hidden under tarps that sagged with weight. It was a scene both infuriating and heartbreaking. Food enough to feed a street, maybe two, being spirited away under cover of darkness. And then came the sound that would change everything: a sharp whistle, followed by the heavy thud of boots on wood. They had been spotted. Lanterns flared along the quay as shadows moved toward them. Seamus grabbed Patrick's arm. "Run," he hissed, and they did, darting through the maze of alleyways, their breath ragged, their hearts pounding against their ribs like drums of warning. Behind them, the pursuit began. In another part of the city, Mary finally reached the river gates, only to find them chained and guarded by two men who bore no official insignia. They stood firm, arms crossed, their eyes cold. "Come back in the morning," one of them barked. But Mary could see the crates already lined up behind them, could smell the faint, sweet scent of baked bread even through the damp air. She begged, pleaded, offered the last of her coins, but they did not yield. She turned away with tears in her eyes, the weight of helplessness pressing on her chest. By dawn, the city buzzed with uneasy whispers. People spoke of wagons that came and went, of guards who claimed the grain had never arrived, of families waiting all night by gates that never opened. Seamus and Patrick did not return home. Nora waited by the window, her fingers tracing the frost that crept along the glass, each moment stretching into something more dreadful. Had they been caught? Or worse, had they vanished into the fog like so many others? The tension in Dublin's famine streets had reached a breaking point. Each unanswered question was a spark, each hungry cry a gust of wind. Somewhere in the city's heart, a plan was forming, one that would either bring relief or ignite chaos. Seamus had seen too much to turn back. Patrick had followed too far to keep silent, and Mary had endured too long to stand still. But the forces moving against them were larger than they knew, tied to decisions made in grand halls far from the cobblestones and cries of the people. And then, just as the city began to stir under the pale morning light, a new rumor spread, a second, more dangerous whisper. It spoke of a blockade not at the docks, but inland, where carts of grain were being deliberately held until prices rose. This was no longer just about hunger. It was about power, about who controlled the flow of life itself. Those wagons Seamus and Patrick had seen were only part of a larger web, one that stretched across the city and beyond. As the church bells rang faintly in the distance, signaling another day of cold struggle, a carriage rolled quietly through the mist toward the governor's residence. Inside sat a man in a dark coat, his face hidden by the brim of his hat. He carried a letter sealed in red wax, a letter that would decide which streets would be fed and which would be left to starve a little longer. And somewhere in that same moment, a group of hungry, desperate people began to plan a march unlike any Dublin had seen before. Would it bring relief or ruin? No one yet knew. But the air was changing, thick with the scent of smoke and the edge of something waiting to break. And in the heart of that restless city, a handful of ordinary lives were about to be swept into a storm far larger than their hunger. The morning mist clung to the city like a shroud, and for a moment Dublin felt suspended between night and day, as if time itself hesitated to move forward. The streets were quieter than usual, yet an undercurrent of unrest seemed to hum beneath the cobblestones. Mary stood by the quay again, her shawl damp from the river breeze, watching the same gates that had denied her just hours before. This time, more people had gathered, mothers with hollowed eyes, fathers with empty baskets, children rubbing their chilled fingers together. They did not speak much, only shifted and waited, their hope thinning as the sun struggled to break through the haze. Farther inland, Seamus and Patrick found themselves taking shelter in the old brewery ruins, their breaths still ragged from the night's chase. The men who had pursued them had not followed this far, or perhaps they had turned their attention elsewhere, but neither boy felt safe. Seamus rubbed his cold hands together, replaying the scene in his mind. The wagons, the whispered orders, the glint of coins changing hands. "They're hiding it," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "Not just here, Patrick, everywhere." Patrick nodded, his jaw clenched. "If people knew, if they saw what we saw," his words trailed off, for they both knew what would happen if such truth was shouted in the streets. Hunger made people brave, but it also made them dangerous. Meanwhile, Nora paced the length of her family's small room, every creak of the floorboards stirring her mother from uneasy sleep. The fire had long died down to faint embers, and the cold pressed him like a second skin. She had sent her brother out to look for food, but now he was gone too long. Each minute dragged like an hour, each hour like a day. She imagined him lying in the street, or locked away somewhere for asking the wrong questions. Her hands twisted the edge of her dress, as if the cloth itself could give her answers. In another part of the city, a different kind of hunger brewed. Wealthier merchants met behind closed doors, their fingers tapping ledgers, their words sharp and calculating. The famine was tragedy for some, but for others, it was opportunity. Grain prices climbed as scarcity deepened, and the more the poor starved, the richer the well-fed became. These men did not walk the famine streets, but their decisions carved them just the same, leaving scars of empty bellies and abandoned homes. They had heard rumors, too, about unrest, about whispers of rebellion forming in the alleys and tenements, and they were already preparing their defenses. As the day wore on, Seamus and Patrick made their way back through the labyrinth of side streets, keeping their heads low. They passed men with sunken cheeks selling handfuls of spoiled potatoes, women boiling weeds for soup, and children chasing rats not for sport, but for survival. Dublin in the 1840s was a city stretched thin, where hope and hunger walked hand in hand, and both could turn on a man without warning. Patrick finally spoke, his voice barely above the din of the street. "Do we tell them what we saw, or do we wait?" Seamus looked at him, the weight of choice heavy on his young face. If we wait, more will starve. If we tell them, they might riot. The word lingered between them, sharp and unsettling. Riot. It was not a word spoken lightly. Yet already, the city seemed to lean in that direction. Its people restless, its nights louder with shouting, its days filled with lines that ended in empty hands. Mary, still at the quay, could feel it too. The crowd behind her had grown less patient. Some pushed forward, others shouted at the guards, their voices hoarse from cold and hunger. The men at the gate shifted uneasily, but did not open the chains. As dusk approached, a new piece of news began to ripple through the streets. It came from Carter, who had overheard the wrong conversation at the right time. A second convoy, larger than the first, was expected to pass through the city after midnight, this time bound for a private storehouse outside the governor's quarters. The grain that might have fed hundreds would instead vanish behind locked doors again. The rumor ignited a spark among those who had been waiting for a chance to act. Seamus heard it from a tinker's boy, Patrick for a washerwoman. Mary overheard it too, carried in hushed tones by two older men outside the fish market. And so the city's hunger twisted into something sharper, resolve. Plans began to form in whispers, in backrooms, in alleyways where the wind howled but the words were kept low. There would be no petitions this time, no pleading at locked gates. The convoy would be met before it left the city, some said. Others argued for seizing the storehouse itself. Few knew who first suggested it, but the idea caught like dry tinder in winter. Nora finally saw her brother return at nightfall, his face pale, his hands trembling from cold and the weight of what he had witnessed. "They're taking it, Nora," he said, before he even closed the door. "They're taking the food, and they're selling it where we can't reach." She wanted to be angry, wanted to demand why he had gone alone, but the anger could not find its way past the fear in her chest. She only nodded, listening as he explained everything, and by the time he finished, the room felt smaller, the air thicker. Even their mother, half awake and coughing, whispered from her cot, "Then do something before we all waste away." The city bells rang again, this time at the hour when most would be inside, saving their strength for another hungry day. But for Seamus, Patrick, Mary, and many like them, the night was only beginning. Lanterns flickered in hidden corners, doors creaked open in forgotten lanes, and the famine streets of Dublin seemed to pulse with a strange, tense life. Hunger had drawn them together, but it was something else now that kept their feet moving, something darker, something more daring. The fog thickened over the river once more, wrapping the city in its cold arms, as if to keep its secrets safe. But secrets have a way of slipping through cracks, especially in places where every whispered plan feels like a last chance. The convoy would come, the wagons would pass, and the people would be waiting, not with petitions this time, but with eyes that no longer pleaded, only watched. And somewhere in the shadows, a figure neither Seamus nor Mary had seen before trailed their steps, his coat heavy with rain and his pockets heavier still with promises written on official paper. He was neither merchant nor commoner, neither guard nor rebel, but his presence would turn the night's plan into something far more dangerous than they had imagined. Would this be the moment the famine streets found their breaking point? Or would the city tighten its grip, forcing them into deeper silence? The answer lay somewhere in the night, carried on the wheels of wagons that had not yet arrived, and in the restless hearts of those who had nothing left to lose but the thin thread of hope they clung to. Night pressed down heavier than before, and the fog returned like a curtain drawn too tightly. Dublin felt suspended between hunger and upheaval, a city balancing on the edge of something it could neither name nor stop. Seamus crouched behind a row of barrels near the quay, the cold biting his hands as he waited for Patrick to return with word from the others. Around him, the narrow lanes whispered with damp wind, carrying the faint sound of distant arguing and the low rumble of carts on the cobbles. Each echo set his nerves on edge, for tonight the streets belonged to neither law nor people. They belonged to whoever moved first. Mary, farther down the lane, kept her eyes fixed on the mist ahead. She had not meant to be part of this. She had gone to the quay for bread, for a chance at something to fill her mother's stomach and still her father's cough. But what she found instead was a crowd no longer content to beg. Whispers of the convoy had reached her too, and though her heart told her to go home, her feet refused to move. The faces around her were drawn tight with the same thought. If they did nothing, the wagons would roll past once more, and hunger would keep its grip on the city. Patrick appeared at last, his breath visible in the cold. "They'll come from the South Road," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. Past the brewery, across the quay, and then out toward the governor's storehouse. "We don't have long." Seamus's jaw tightened. "How many know?" Patrick shrugged. "Enough to matter. Not enough to make it clean." The plan was simple, though born of desperation rather than strategy. They would block the road, stop the wagons, and demand their share. Not all wanted violence. Many prayed it would not come to that. But desperation is a language that needs no teacher, and tonight it spoke clearly in every clenched hand and hollow stomach. Meanwhile, across the city, Norris sat by the dying fire, her mother's breath rattling softly in the background. Every sound outside made her start, for she knew where her brother had gone. The streets were changing. She could feel it in the way neighbors avoided each other's eyes, in the hurried steps and shuttered windows. The famine was no longer a quiet suffering. It had become a wound that refused to close. As the moon climbed higher, the convoy began its approach. 3 wagons, each heavy with tarp cargo, creaked over the southern bridge under the guard of 6 men with rifles slung over their shoulders. Their boots struck the stone like a metronome, their eyes scanning the shadows. One of them muttered about the chill, another about the lateness of the hour. None spoke of the faces they might meet, though each knew they would not pass unnoticed. Seamus and Patrick waited until they saw the first glint of lantern light bouncing against the damp stones. Mary stepped forward, her breath catching in her throat as the crowd behind her stirred. A man with a broken hat whispered a signal, and 2 others rolled an empty cart across the lane, blocking the path. The convoy slowed, wheels grinding to a halt. For a moment, only the river's low rush filled the silence. Then came the voices. "Move aside," one guard barked, his tone sharp but edged with unease. "By order of the governor, this cargo is not for your hands." The crowd murmured, their hunger turning to heat. Seamus stepped forward, his voice steady despite the tremor in his limbs. "Then whose hands, sir? We starve while you move bread through the night." Patrick added, "We know what's in those wagons." The guards shifted, fingers brushing the wood of their rifles, but they did not raise them. Not yet. The leader glanced at the crowd and saw not a mob, but something more dangerous, resolve born of hunger. "Step aside," he repeated, but this time it sounded less like command and more like plea. What happened next began as a ripple. A woman threw a stone, not at a man, but at the ground near his feet. Another shouted, and a boy tugged at a tarp, revealing the edge of a sack marked with the grain seal. The smell of bread crust and dried oats escaped into the cold, and with it, restraint began to fray. Mary felt her heart hammer against her ribs as hands pushed past her, reaching for the sacks. Seamus grabbed one, then another, tossing them toward the back of the crowd. Patrick tried to hold the line, shouting for calm, but the sound was swallowed by the rising chorus of need. The guards stepped forward at last, pushing, shoving, their rifles clutched tight but still not fired. One shouted for reinforcements. In that moment of chaos, a figure emerged from the shadows. The same man who had followed them before, his coat glistening with rain, his face half hidden beneath his brim. He moved with purpose, cutting through the confusion, and when he reached the lead wagon, he did not grab at the sacks or shout at the guards. Instead, he produced a paper, sealed in red wax, stamped with the mark of the governor, and handed it to the convoy leader. The guard's face paled. Orders were exchanged in hurried whispers. The wagons, instead of retreating, began to turn, not toward the people, not back the way they came, but down a side lane that led deeper into the city, away from both quay and storehouse. Seamus stared, his voice lost in the din. Where are they taking it now? Patrick shouted. "They're moving it again." The crowd surged, some following, others breaking away in frustration. Mary found herself pulled along by the current, her feet stumbling over the wet stones. Hunger had become something else entirely. Confusion, anger, desperation entwined. And as the convoy disappeared once more into the fog, a new whisper rose among the people. There was someone behind this, someone playing both sides. By the time the bells tolled midnight, the city was no longer calm. Torches flickered in unexpected corners, doors slammed against the cold, and the line between rebellion and survival blurred further. Seamus and Patrick found themselves separated in the crush, Mary lost somewhere behind them, and above it all the unseen hand moved its pieces. Wagons rerouted, guards replaced, orders rewritten. The famine streets had reached a turning point, but not the one anyone expected. What had begun as hunger had become a chase, and now it felt like a game with rules no one understood. Somewhere in the governor's hall or the merchant's ledger, a decision had already been made, and its shadow stretched across every cobble, every narrow lane, every empty bowl. The night was not over. It had only shifted its weight, waiting for the next move. And as the mist thickened once more, it carried a promise not of relief, but of reckoning. The city awoke to a strange silence the next morning, the kind that comes when something has shifted in the night, but the streets have not yet learned how to speak of it. Smoke lingered low over the river, and the air carried the scent of damp earth mixed with something faintly sweet, grain dust scattered where the convoy had turned and vanished. Mary walked the quay once more, her steps slow, her shawl drawn tight, and found no wagons, no guards, no crates. Only scattered footprints marked where the crowd had stood, where hope had surged and then slipped away like mist. Seamus emerged from the ruins of a nearby building, his clothes damp, his eyes red with sleeplessness. Patrick followed a moment later, a sack slung over his shoulder, not full of grain, but torn, spilling a few handfuls of oats that had been trampled in the chaos. "This is all we saved," Patrick said quietly. Seamus looked at the meager grains in his palm and closed his fist around them. "It's enough to tell the truth," he replied. Word spread quickly that morning, not of triumph, but of betrayal. The convoy had not gone to the governor's storehouse after all. It had been diverted again, this time to a private wharf where ships waited under cover of night. Grain meant for Dublin had left the city entirely, bound for markets across the sea where prices were higher and mouths less desperate. Hunger here had been turned into profit elsewhere. The news hit the streets like a stone dropped in a still pond, at first only ripples, then waves. By midday, people gathered once more, this time not to wait, but to march. Men who had kept silent now shouted, women who had begged now demanded, and children too young to understand joined in the press of bodies moving toward the governor's hall. Mary found herself among them, her hands trembling, but her feet steady. Seamus and Patrick moved ahead, carrying not weapons but torn sacks as proof of what they had seen. Nora, pale from worry, followed in their wake, her mother's words echoing in her ears, "Do something." The hall doors stood closed when they arrived, guarded by men in heavy coats. The crowd called for answers. They wanted names. They wanted the ships brought back. They wanted to know why their hunger had been sold for silver. The guards shifted uneasily, for this was no longer a scattered protest. It was a city gathered with one voice. A messenger slipped inside, and the doors finally opened. The man who emerged was the same figure from the night before, his dark coat now dry, his expression unreadable. He raised the letter he carried, its red wax broken. By order of the governor, he announced, the grain was sent to England for trade. Compensation will be considered. His words fell like stones into a well, cold, unfeeling, and deep. The crowd surged forward, but Seamus stepped ahead of them, his voice cutting through the rising roar. "You traded our lives for coin," he said. "We watched the wagons leave. We chased them through the night. And now you tell us there is nothing left." The man did not flinch. "The city owes debts," he replied. "Sacrifices must be made." It was then the unexpected twist came, the thing no one in that crowd could have foreseen. For behind the man stepped a frail figure, One of the governor's own aides, pale and trembling, his hand clutching a second parchment. "He's lying," the aide said, his voice breaking. The grain was never meant to leave. The order was forged. The crowd froze, the weight of his words settling like frost. The man in the dark coat turned sharply, his composure cracking. "Enough," he hissed, reaching for the parchment, but it was too late. Seamus had already snatched it, holding it high for all to see. The seal was false, the orders faked to mask a theft carried out under the governor's name. It was not the city that had chosen to starve them. It was a small circle of merchants and their hired men, twisting the famine for their gain. The hall erupted. Guards wavered, some stepping aside as the truth tore through the crowd like wind through dry reeds. Patrick grabbed Mary's hand to pull her back, for the press of bodies grew dangerous now. But her eyes were fixed on Seamus, who stood firm with the parchment clutched in his fist. "Show them," someone shouted, and he did, his voice ringing over the din. "This is their doing, not ours." The man in the coat fled, his dark silhouette swallowed by the alleyways, his power undone by a single slip of wax and ink. Behind him, the governor's hall opened its doors fully at last, not in welcome, but in surrender to the tide that swept in. By evening, the streets that had been silent now hummed with a different energy. Grain was recovered from hidden stores, redistributed to the poorest lanes first. Not enough to heal the famine, not enough to mend every wound, but enough to remind the city that truth still had teeth. Mary carried home a loaf of coarse bread, warm from the hearths where the people baked for one another. Her mother wept as she tore it. Her father closed his eyes as if the scent alone could feed him. Seamus stood by the river, the wind cold on his face, and wondered what would follow. Justice had come, but only in part. Hunger still walked the streets, debts still whispered in dark rooms, and the men who had stolen the grain were not all caught. Patrick joined him, tossing a stone into the dark water. "We stopped them this time," he said. "But what about the next?" Seamus did not answer. He watched the mist roll in again, thin and curling like the breath of a city still too weary to sleep. Somewhere across the sea, ships unloaded their stolen cargo, and somewhere here, new plans were already being drawn. The famine streets of Dublin had found their voice, but the echo of that voice carried far, into halls of power, into ledgers and letters, into the uneasy dreams of those who had thought hunger would keep the people quiet. For a night, they had risen. For a moment, they had changed their fate. And in that moment, the city felt less like a prison and more like a promise, fragile, flickering, but alive. The dawn over Dublin arrived heavy and gray, as though the sky itself carried the weight of the suffering below. The mist rolled slowly through the narrow streets, carrying with it the sharp tang of sea air mixed with the stale scent of decay and damp stone. Bridget stood by the threshold of the old chapel, her fingers clutched tightly around the rosary that had belonged to her mother. It was cracked and worn now, the beads cool and smooth like river stones, yet it was the only thing that gave her strength as the climax of their struggle finally seemed to crest over the horizon. For weeks, they had fought hunger, disease, betrayal, and despair, and now the moment that would decide their survival was at hand. But what she had never imagined was how bitter and tangled this resolution would feel. In the distance, Seamus limped down the lane, his boots caked with mud from the countryside. His face was pale, lips pressed into a thin line, and his eyes darted from shadow to shadow. He had been gone for 3 days, searching for grain, for work, for anything that could keep the children alive another week. Yet the sack on his back seemed far too light, and when he finally reached Bridget, he avoided her gaze. There was something in his expression, part triumph, part shame, that made her stomach knot. He set the sack down between them, the dull thud echoing far louder than it should have in the empty street. Bridget opened it and found not only a few precious handfuls of barley, but also a sealed letter stamped with the mark of the landlord. She looked at Seamus, her brows drawn tight. "What is this?" she asked. Her voice was low, nearly a whisper, but it carried the sharpness of suspicion. Seamus hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck as though the words were thorns lodged in his throat. He made an offer, Seamus finally said. A cruel one, but maybe our only chance. As he explained, the truth unraveled like a frayed rope. The landlord had promised them a place in the next shipment of aid leaving Dublin, a chance to cross the sea to England where work was rumored to be plentiful. But in return, they would have to leave their small, crumbling home behind for good. Worse, Seamus had been told that the only way to secure the deal was to persuade others in their street to leave as well, to empty the lane so the landlord could clear it for new plans. It was a trade that tasted of betrayal, salvation for their family at the cost of their neighbor's ruin. Bridget felt her hands tremble. Around her, the city was full of whispers, families being turned out, houses left to rot, streets emptied by promises that often led nowhere. She thought of the children, their thin arms wrapped around her waist as they slept, and of the old woman down the street who had given them her last loaf just 2 days ago. Was this what survival demanded? A choice between loyalty and life? Her heart pounded as the church bell tolled in the distance, a hollow sound that marked another morning in a city that had forgotten its people. Meanwhile, Liam, the quiet boy with ash-colored hair who had followed Seamus on part of his journey, lingered nearby. He had seen more than Seamus realized. He had overheard the landlord's men laughing about the plan, about how the promise of safe passage would only be given to a handful, leaving the rest stranded with nothing but locked doors and empty streets. He wanted to tell Bridget, but fear held his tongue. If he spoke, would Seamus be shamed? Would the last fragile hope they clung to be shattered? Liam carried his secret like a stone in his chest, heavy and cold. The day stretched on, and the streets grew restless. News spread that a ship had indeed arrived at the docks, its hold rumored to carry barrels of flour and sacks of cornmeal. People shuffled toward the river, hollow-eyed and desperate, their feet dragging through the muck. Bridget joined the flow, her mind spinning, the rosary clutched tighter than ever. Seamus walked beside her, his face set in grim resolve, while Liam followed a few steps behind, his hands buried deep in his pockets, fingernails digging into his palms. When they reached the quay, the truth was far worse than the rumors. The ship was there, yes, but its cargo was locked behind guarded doors, its contents already marked for the wealthy and the powerful. A line of carriages stood ready to carry the goods away, leaving only the scent of promised bread in the air for the poor to taste. The crowd murmured, then began to shout. A stone clattered across the cobbles. A woman screamed. The guards shifted their stance, hands on their rifles, eyes cold and unflinching. Bridget's heart raced as the crowd surged. She held onto Seamus's sleeve, but the tide of bodies pushed them apart. She stumbled, nearly falling, and when she looked up, she saw Liam climbing a stack of barrels to get a better view. His eyes were fixed on something beyond the chaos. The landlord's men, exchanging envelopes behind a curtain of crates. It was proof, he realized, of the deal that would decide who would eat and who would starve. And in that moment, Liam made a choice. He leapt down from the barrels and ran, not away from the chaos, but straight toward Bridget. The air crackled with the tension of something about to break. Shouts rose to a roar, boots thundered on the planks, and the guards leveled their rifles as the hungry pressed closer. Bridget reached for Liam just as he skidded to a halt beside her. His voice was raw, almost breaking. They lied. It's a trick. They're taking everything and leaving us with nothing. His words cut through the din like a blade. Seamus turned, his face pale as ash, and for a moment everything seemed to still. The roar of the crowd, the crash of the tide, even the distant cry of gulls. Bridget stared at him, her mind a storm of disbelief and dread. The choice she had feared was gone now, replaced by a new reality. There would be no passage, no grain, no mercy. Only the reckoning of those who had been fooled, and those who had tried, in their desperation, to make a deal with the very hand that starved them. The crowd began to move again, this time not in fear, but in anger. A barrel toppled, a rope snapped, and the first carriage door was torn open. The ship's guards raised their rifles. Seamus grabbed Bridget's arm. "We have to go now," he said, his voice sharp with urgency. But Bridget did not move. Her eyes were fixed on the ship, on the carriages, on the flicker of something deeper within the chaos. It was not just about hunger anymore. It was about the truth, about the lies behind those locked doors, about the chance, slim and dangerous though it might be, to expose what had been done to them all. The mist thickened as the sun struggled to rise higher, casting the quay in a pale, cold light. Somewhere in the distance, church bells began to toll again, not for mass, but for alarm. The city was waking, and it would not wake gently. Would Bridget and Seamus flee and save only themselves, or stand in the path of something far larger than their own hunger? Would Liam's secret bring them ruin, or lead to the one spark of hope they still had? The air was heavy with smoke and salt as the first shot cracked across the quay, and everything they had known teetered on the edge of collapse. The crack of the first shot sent a ripple through the crowd, a sound that made people stumble back as if the air itself had torn. For a moment, everything froze. The gulls overhead stilled, the waves lapped quietly against the dock, and even the cries of hunger seemed to hush. Bridget felt Seamus pull at her arm again, his grip tight and trembling. Liam stood close to her, his face pale, but his jaw set with a determination that hadn't been there before. Around them, the chaos surged and faltered, as if the city itself was deciding whether to erupt or to fold in on its own exhaustion. Then the crowd shifted, not with rage this time, but with purpose. A group of women, shawls pulled tight around their thin shoulders, began to gather children and lead them away from the dock. A few men pried open the barrels that had fallen, not to hoard the grain, but to scatter it among those who had nothing left to lose. The guards, seeing that this was not a riot but a desperate act of survival, lowered their rifles one by one. The landlord's men slipped away in the confusion, their fine coats disappearing into the mist, leaving only the whisper of broken promises behind. Bridget looked at Seamus, her heart aching with the weight of what they had endured and what had almost been lost. He met her gaze, shame flickering in his eyes, but also relief. Relief that the deal he had almost made would not be the curse that haunted their family forever. He reached into the sack he had carried and pulled out the handful of barley he had managed to secure. It was not much, but it was real, and for now it was enough. They walked back through the narrow streets of Dublin as the day grew older, passing shuttered shops and cold hearths. The smell of smoke lingered, but so did something else, a quiet strength in the way neighbors shared what little they had left, in the way children still managed to laugh as they chased one another through the alleys, in the way the city, though broken, still held its people together. Liam walked ahead, his hands no longer clenched in his pockets. He had told the truth when it mattered, and though it did not bring them riches or safety, it brought them clarity. That evening, Bridget gathered the children near the fire. The barley was simmering in a thin broth, and the smell of it filled the small room with something close to comfort. Seamus sat beside her, his shoulders heavy, but his voice steady as he spoke of what came next. They would not leave Dublin after all, not under the terms that had been set. Instead, they would stay, find work where they could, mend the nets for the fishermen. So for the soldiers, sweep the streets if they had to. It would not be easy, but it would be theirs. Liam returned with news that some of the food taken from the dock had been divided fairly among the poorest streets by dawn. It was a small victory, and no one expected it to last, but it meant the children would eat again, at least for a few days. The landlord's men would likely return with new promises and new threats, but the people had seen through the veil now. Whispers of organizing, of petitioning, of writing letters to officials in London began to spread. Hunger had made them weak, but truth had made them unafraid. As night fell, the city quieted. The mist settled over the river like a blanket, softening the edges of the warehouses and the cobblestones. Bridget sat by the window, the rosary still in her hand, and watched the faint glow of lanterns in the distance. She thought of the choices they had made, of how close they had come to turning on their neighbors, of how one boy's courage had stopped a lie from spreading further. The famine was not over, nor the hardships that came with it, but she felt something stir in her chest that she had not felt in many months, a small, stubborn kind of hope. The children fell asleep one by one, their breaths even and light. Seamus leaned his head against the wall, his eyes closing at last after days of restless wandering. Outside, a cart rattled by carrying sacks of peat, and the faint sound of a fiddle rose from a nearby tenement, thin but persistent, like a thread stitching the night together. Life, fragile and frayed as it was, went on. In the weeks that followed, the city saw more ships, some as false in their promises as the one before, others carrying small but genuine relief. Bridget and her neighbors learned to read the signs, to question the men who spoke too smoothly, to trust the hands that shared rather than the mouths that boasted. They planted what little they could in the scraps of earth that lined the alleyways, traded skills instead of coins, and cared for one another when the sickness crept through the streets again. Liam grew bolder, often running messages between the lanes, bringing word of where bread might be found or where a sick child needed medicine. Seamus, humbled by his near betrayal, became one of the first to volunteer when work crews were called to repair the docks. Bridget stitched uniforms late into the night, her fingers aching but her heart steady. Together, they found a rhythm, not a life of plenty, but a life that was theirs to shape. The famine left its scars on Dublin, deep and lasting. Some families left and never returned. Some children did not survive the winter. But the story of that day on the quay, of the promise broken, the grain scattered, the people choosing one another over fear, became something more than a memory. It became a warning and a lesson, told in whispers and later in songs, that desperation can turn neighbor against neighbor, but truth and courage can turn it back again. Years later, when the worst had passed and the city began to breathe easier, Bridget would walk with her children along the same quay. The warehouses stood still, the river rolled on, and the gulls wheeled overhead. She would tell them of that day, not with bitterness, but with the quiet strength of one who had endured it. She would tell them how a city on the edge of ruin found a way to hold itself together, how even in the darkest streets, the faintest light can matter. And in that telling, the streets of 1840s Dublin, once so desperate and hollow, found a place in history, not only for their suffering, but for their resilience. Hunger had tried to erase them, but it had not succeeded. The people had survived, scarred but unbroken, their names carried forward not in ledgers or official records, but in the stories told by those who came after. And somewhere, in a quiet room on a cold night, a mother still whispered a prayer over a pot of barley, grateful not for what they had lost, but for what they had managed to keep: one another.